As everybody knows, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was re-elected president on June 24th, 10 days ago. He won with 52.6% of the vote, far ahead of his next closest challenger, Muharrem İnce of the Republican People's Party, or CHP by its Turkish acronym. İnce received 30.6%, 22 percentage points less than Erdogan. By winning a majority, Erdogan averted the need for a second-round runoff against İnce. The result continued a pattern of narrow Erdogan victories, a reflection of the deepening polarization of Turkish society between pro and anti-Erdogan forces. This was only the second time the Turks elected their president directly. The first time was 2014, when Erdogan also got slightly more than half the votes in the first round. However, this election marked the first time in Turkish history that Turks voted simultaneously and separately for the head of their government and for their parliament. The election and swearing in of Erdogan and the parliament on July 8th, this coming Sunday, will trigger a new system in Turkey with greatly enhanced powers for the presidency. This is the result of wide-ranging, government-sponsored constitutional amendments narrowly passed, possibly as a result of fraud, in a public referendum last year. In this system, the president will be the all-powerful master of the executive branch, with unreviewable powers of appointment and a broad ability to govern through decree. The prime ministry will cease to exist. Nevertheless, the parliament will retain some important powers, at least on paper, including the right to overrule presidential decrees. So let's look at the parliamentary vote as well. In the parliament vote, Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, AKP by its Turkish acronym, won an unprecedented sixth straight election, although for the second time in the past 3 elections, it failed to win an outright parliamentary majority. It came very close. It won 295 seats in the 600-seat parliament, leaving it just 6 votes short of a majority. Erdogan is likely to pick up the extra votes he needs in parliament through the alliance he has maintained over the past 3 years, formally during the election campaign, but otherwise informally, with the hard-right Turkish nationalist party called the Nationalist Movement Party, or MHP by its Turkish acronym. He, that is Erdogan, will also probably try to lure a few parliamentarians to AKP from other parties to ensure an absolute majority for AKP on its own, so that it won't have to rely on MHP. In that regard, a likely target is former Interior Minister Meral Akşener's İyi, or Good Party. Now, Good is the English translation of the name of her party, İyi. It's kind of, perhaps, might strike some people as a funny name. It doesn't tell you much about what the party stands for, except that it aspires to be good. But when written with uppercase letters, it is reminiscent of a symbol that is dear to many Turkish nationalists, that evokes an ancient Turkic people. And Akşener herself is seen as quite nationalist, and indeed she used to be a member of MHP. Akşener's party, newly formed last year as, in effect, a breakaway from MHP, was expected to far outpace its nationalist rival, MHP, in the parliamentary vote. In fact, MHP won the intranationalist contest, finishing 4th overall with 11% of the vote and 49 seats, to the İyi Party's 5th place finish with 10% of the vote and 43 seats. Many who joined İyi did so because they expected it to be a winner, or at a minimum, at least the winner on the nationalist right, with the prospect of absorbing what was anticipated to be a collapsed MHP. Now that that prospect is no longer tenable, That is, MHP very clearly did not collapse. And now that EE is out in the wilderness of the opposition with no real leverage to speak of within Parliament, it would not be surprising to see some of its members of Parliament seduced into signing up with Erdogan's AKP, providing AKP with the few extra MPs necessary to achieve the absolute parliamentary majority it could not win at the polls. I've mentioned that AK Party came in first and that MHP was fourth, EE was fifth. So what about the in-between? The Secular Republican People's Party, or CHP, that's the party of presidential candidate Muharrem İnce, who we mentioned a few minutes ago, and more famously, the party established by Turkey's founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, nearly a century ago. That party finished second in the parliamentary vote with 22.6% of the vote and 146 seats. It marked the sixth straight parliamentary election in which CHP has finished a distant second to AKP. In third place was the Kurdish rights-focused and Kurdish-dominated People's Democracy Party, or HDP, with 11.7% of the vote and 67 seats. Under Turkish law, a party must receive 10% of the national vote in order to enter parliament. HDP succeeded in doing that for the first time in June 2015, and this is now the third consecutive election in which it has managed to win parliamentary seats. In both the presidential and parliamentary elections, the basic pattern of recent elections remained intact. The secular CHP wins the Western Aegean coast and the Western Mediterranean coast. The HDP dominates the Kurdish population in the southeast. And MHP, Turkish nationalists, have a meaningful presence in central Anatolia, which they share as a junior partner to AKP. But the AKP itself remains the only party in Turkey that is competitive all over the nation, winning the overwhelming majority of the provinces and rarely finishing worse than second anywhere. The election results provoke myriad questions, but let me just try to address four of them in the brief time we have. They are: first, was the election free and fair? Second, why did AKP get so many fewer votes for parliament than its leader Erdogan received for president? Third, why did MHP perform so much better than expected? The polls were showing prior to the election that MHP would get somewhere between 3 and 6% of the vote, which is what led to the expectation that it might crumble and be absorbed by Akşener's EE party. And fourth, how significant is it that the Kurdish-dominated HDP got into parliament for the third consecutive election? Does it hold any meaning for the prospect of a solution to Turkey's long-standing and most difficult issue, the Kurdish problem? First, was the election free and fair? Well, clearly the campaign wasn't fair. Turkey's media industry is overwhelmingly controlled by pro-Erdogan forces. It said that roughly 90% of the media is pro-Erdogan, and that media made sure that the opposition got minimal coverage, even when millions attended opposition rallies in the closing days of the campaign. In the Kurdish-dominated southeast, access to the ballot box was suppressed for at least tens of thousands of voters and possibly up to 200,000 whose place of voting, whose polling stations, were moved to distant towns, ostensibly for security reasons. This was somewhat odd because, if anything, security is much better now in those areas. There is less violence in those areas than there was during the last election, the last several elections, when the polling stations were not moved. Further, thousands of members of the pro-Kurdish rights HDP were arrested in the course of the campaign. And to top it off, the entire campaign and election were conducted under emergency rule, which has been in place for 2 years and gives Turkish security officials extraordinary powers to suppress demonstrations and other manifestations of free speech. Okay, but was the vote count itself honest? So far, there are plenty of rumors of ballot box stuffing and tampering, and the election was conducted under an election law passed in March that seemingly facilitated ballot box stuffing. Nevertheless, no clear proof of fraud has emerged. Unless and until it does, the count must be deemed legitimate. In his concession speech, widely viewed as gracious, the candidate who finished number 2 in the presidential race, the aforementioned Muharrem İnce, claimed that there had been fraud, but not enough to explain what he called the 10 million vote gap. It was actually 11 million between him and Erdogan. And therefore, he said, Erdogan should be seen as the legitimate winner. This is somewhat puzzling because İnce did not address the issue of whether the fraud had been large enough to explain the roughly 1.8 million vote gap between Erdogan's official vote total and the 50% mark that would have forced a second round runoff. And I should mention 1.8 may sound like a lot, but in the referendum on the constitutional amendments last year, the OSCE delegation that monitored estimated that it was possible that up between 1 and 2.5 million votes were fraudulent. So that 1.8 would fall within the range between 1 and 2.5 million. That doesn't mean there was that much fraud, only that the vote total that put Erdogan over the 50% mark in the first round is far more significant than the vote gap between him and İnce. OSCE election monitors were also present this time around, and they will issue a report in just a few weeks, rendering their assessment of the election and the vote count. That report will be important in shaping perceptions, no doubt. But whatever the verdict of the OSCE, the official results, as announced by the Turkish government already, are the ones that will stand. Questions 2 and 3. The gap between the Erdogan presidential vote and the AKP parliamentary vote on the one hand, and the unanticipated success of MHP on the other are linked. Those two questions are linked. For the first time, Turkish voters were casting separate and simultaneous votes for the head of government, the president, and for parliament, as I pointed out. Also for the first time, this is a bit complex, but hang with me. Also for the first time, some of the parties were running for parliament in blocks. There were 2 main blocks, the Cumhur or People's Bloc, which grouped AKP and MHP, and the Millet or Nation Bloc, that grouped 3 main opposition parties, the secular CHP, Akşener's nationalist EE party, and a small Islamist but anti-Erdogan party called Saadet. Besides the parties in these 2 blocs, the only competitive party in the election was the Kurdish-dominated HDP, which did not affiliate with any bloc. Actually, it was widely reported that HDP wanted to be part of the opposition bloc, but that idea was vetoed by the Turkish nationalist Meral Akşener, the head of the EE party. So AKP ended up with 42.6% of the parliamentary vote, exactly 10 percentage points less than Erdogan received in the presidential contest. We don't know why so many Erdogan voters chose not to vote for his party, but we can hazard a reasonable guess. It seems likely that many voters, recognizing that Erdogan was about to assume immense new presidential powers, decided to check his power by voting for AKP's only bloc partner, MHP. For such voters, those who wanted Erdogan as president, but with some degree of checks and balances, MHP really was the only choice, since they weren't going to go so far as to vote for a party in the opposition bloc. And this also helps to explain why MHP ended up outdistancing the EE party. Originally, Auctioneer was hoping her party would attract not only most of the former MHP voters, but also former AKP voters. I think she might have been able to do that, but for one fact. She wanted to run for president, and her presidential campaign was an abysmal failure. A part of that was that she couldn't get any traction in the media, which wasn't entirely her fault for reasons we've already mentioned. But she came in a distant fourth in the presidential race with only 8% of the vote. Not only did she trail Erdogan and Ince, but she trailed the Kurdish party's candidate as well, who was actually forced to campaign from prison. That's another story in itself. So her presidential campaign was a failure. In retrospect, it seems her best bet would have been to run only for parliament, unaffiliated with any bloc, while declaring that her party would work with whoever wins the presidency on an issue-by-issue basis. Had she done that, her party may indeed have attracted some of the checks and balances voters, those who voted for Erdogan but not his party, that otherwise went to MHP. Of course, this is only my speculation. The fourth question is, what's in store for the HDP, the pro-Kurdish Rights Party? There was celebrating in Diyarbakir, the main city in the Kurdish populated area of Turkey, celebrating, that is, on June 24th, because HDP had once more succeeded in getting over the 10% threshold and getting into parliament. But there is little prospect, in my view, that anything good will come of it regarding the long-standing Kurdish problem. The HDP was helped getting over the 10% threshold by small numbers of non-Kurdish Turkish liberals, some supporting HDP's liberal agenda, and some voting merely tactically to get them into parliament to diminish AKP's portion of parliament. I won't tax you with further explanations of Turkey's electoral system, but suffice it to say that had HDP fallen below 10% and thus failed to get into parliament, AKP would have won dozens of additional seats and thus would have had an overwhelming parliamentary majority instead of falling just short of a majority as actually happened. And that's why some voters who did not necessarily agree with or like HDP voted for HDP tactically as a means of suppressing AKP's parliamentary representation. Look, Erdogan dislikes the HDP, which has actively opposed him, and he shows no interest in reviving the peace process he once courageously pursued with the Kurds. That process came to a decisive end with the Turkish military's onslaught against several Turkish towns where pro-PKK forces were ensconced 3 years ago. To the extent Erdogan might be inclined to renew the peace process, the MHP, his unofficial coalition partner, remember, will be there to make sure he gets steered back to the Turkish nationalist path. The Kurdish problem anyway is unlikely ever to be solved through a parliamentary process unless there is initiative from the head of government, and there is no prospect of that now. 20% of HDP MPs from the last parliament are in jail. Many others were detained and then released during their term of office. Nobody should be surprised if the current incumbents meet a similar fate. Notwithstanding the implementation of a new presidency-focused system in Turkey, governance probably won't look much different to outsiders than previously, particularly not much different than it has for the past 2 years, since the declaration of emergency rule following the failed coup attempt of July 2016. Under emergency rule, Erdogan has essentially been able to decree whatever he wants, and the Constitutional Court has said that it has no jurisdiction over emergency rule decrees. So opposition efforts to contest those decrees have fallen on deaf ears. Now, following this election, Erdogan will continue to call all the shots, and he will be able to do so constitutionally by decree, based on these new powers given in last year's referendum. Given AKP's near majority in parliament and its close working relationship with the Turkish nationalist MHP, as well as its prospect for using its considerable patronage and other forms of leverage to lure other MPs from other parties, Erdogan can pretty much count on having a rubber stamp parliament. Continuity in foreign policy is also likely, which isn't good news for the US, the Western Alliance, Israel, Egypt, and many of the Arab monarchies. It is good news, I should add, for Qatar, where Turkey has established a small military base and which has come to view relations with Turkey as critical to fending off the isolation and boycott imposed on it last year by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Erdogan's resentment over Greek refusal to extradite accused Gulenist Turkish soldiers who fled Turkey in the wake of the coup is likely to continue to roil Aegean relations. Nor is there any prospect of Turkey softening its approach to the Cyprus problem and related Eastern Mediterranean gas exploration issues. Now, is there any chance that Erdogan will alter the nationalist, sovereigntist, Muslim Brotherhood sympathetic path he's pursued in recent years? It seems to me perhaps only in this case, perhaps. Many economists are expecting a very serious economic downturn in Turkey in the months to come. Many are saying a crisis is likely. The Turkish lira has lost roughly 15% of its value against the dollar already in 2018. Year-on-year inflation is at a 14-year high, measuring at just over 15% in June. Now, it should be remembered that the Turkish economy has often proven more resilient than economists' predictions. We should keep that in mind. Still, should the worst happen, and should Turkey need an IMF bailout, Turkey might just project a friendlier attitude toward the wealthy Western nations that dominate IMF decision-making. At this point, however, the reasonable overall conclusion must be that Turkish voters have chosen 5 more years of continuity and Erdogan dominance. The only exit from recent policies during those 5 years being the whims of an all-powerful president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the longest-serving leader of Turkey in the history of the Republic. Thank you very much.